Now let's turn to Katrina Pacey. She is a lawyer with Pivot Legal Society. She joins us now live from Vancouver. Also an intervener in this case that was brought up before the Supreme Court. So thank you for your time, Katrina. And what are your thoughts? We were just listening to Justice Minister Peter MacKay there, and so there's a slew of things to go through. But your initial reaction to this legislation?
Well, this legislation is going to have absolutely devastating impact on sex worker safety and on communities across the country. The minister, I mean, this is more devastating than anything I could have imagined would have come out of Minister MacKay's office, given what he heard about the harms that criminalization creates, what the Bedford decision stood for, which is that sex work happens and sex workers have a right to do so safely, and just, you know, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which really clearly indicates that the law cannot stand in between sex workers' ability to take safety-enhancing measures, and that's exactly what this legislation does.
How does it do that?
Well, it actually, I mean, it really skirts around everything that the Bedford judgment that the Supreme Court of Canada found in finding what I guess the minister would say are creative ways to get around the laws that were struck down. So there remain very strong and strict restrictions on public communication, which are essential safety measures for street-based sex workers. There are provisions around advertising and so forth that will limit the ability of sex workers to work indoors. There are limitations on the ability to work with others who may be safety enhancing, despite what the minister says. The interpretation of those provisions will be overbroad and will capture safety-enhancing measures. And so there's just a range of provisions in there that we're very concerned about from sex workers' rights perspective, from a human rights perspective. We will see more missing and murdered women, in my view, as a result of this legislation.
I mean, Justice Minister Peter MacKay is saying that this legislation is taking away the support systems that, you know, help the pimps and the Johns, and they're going after those people, the pimps and the Johns and the consumers, those people who, you know, maybe society perceived as the people who are enabling the dangers around this. So does this not help sex workers in any way?
The legislation does not help sex workers. Laws that punish or say that it's illegal to purchase sex, or laws that target what you might call third parties, people that are not sex workers but may be involved in the sex industry, really are not assisting sex workers in terms of their safety. In fact, it drives the industry underground. It, as I say, limits the ability of sex workers to engage in relationships with others that are safety enhancing or are legitimate relationships, and really instead makes it underground, makes it much more dangerous. We issued a report yesterday that showed the impact of criminalizing clients in Vancouver, which showed that sex workers on the streets of Vancouver continue to face incredibly dangerous circumstances. Even though the police are not arresting sex workers right now and going after clients, sex workers continue to face egregious risks, and that's what this legislation will replicate.
Well, it'll be interesting to hear the conversations that come out of this, but at least, I mean, it seems that it at least discourages the industry, especially in the sense that $20 million is being put aside to help people get help and leave the industry. What do you make of that?
Well, you know, I work in the downtown east side, and I work with a range of support services that really meet sex workers where they're at. For sex workers who want to stay in the industry, they deserve the supports that sex workers who want to leave the industry deserve to have access to. So we're, of course, completely supportive of supports and resources, but it should not be contingent on wanting to exit sex work. It should be respecting of people's choices and meeting them where they're at and ensuring that their choices and their life decisions are valued.
What about the Justice Minister saying that, you know, a full criminalization or legalization would lead to some sort of an extreme on opposite ends of the spectrum, saying that actually, you know, legalizing it would lead to an increase in human trafficking?
The evidence just does not support that. If you look at New Zealand, which fully decriminalized sex work and adult sex work in 2003, they're a Tier 1 country in terms of the U.S. Trafficking in Persons report. They've had no cases of human trafficking in New Zealand, and what they've found is that sex workers have much greater access to police protection, much safer working conditions. They're in much better position. And what I would say, contrary to what the minister said, is this is in fact full criminalization. What he is presenting, there may be sort of certain circumstances where a sex worker is not targeted by the law, but in my view and on my quick read of the legislation, it's very broad, it's very sweeping, and it's going to result in sex workers going to jail, which is exactly what Canadians are not asking for. Canadians are asking for sex workers' rights and safety to be respected.
Is it safer in the sense that people will be able to work at home? I know that that was part of the case, and you're saying that this is actually taking away from a sex trade worker's opportunity to work in the trade, but I don't understand how someone couldn't work at home safely with this legislation.
Certainly. Well, if you think about someone's ability to set up a safer an indoor venue where sex work might happen, whether that was from a private residence or from more of a business establishment, how is someone supposed to do that when all the police have to do is park outside and target their clients as they go in? So, this is exactly why targeting clients does not mean sex workers have access to indoor workspaces, which is what the Supreme Court of Canada said sex workers have the right to. And so that's one example. The advertising restrictions. How are you supposed to operate a business and be, whether you're working independently or with others, where you can't advertise and you can't tell people that you're available, whether that be online or in the back of a newspaper. So, as I say, the minister has found very specific ways to limit, in my view, all of the safe ways in which sex work might happen.
Maybe it's not supposed to happen. He said most people view prostitution as a dehumanizing phenomenon that puts people at risk.
That is the perspective that the minister said, and the reality is that sex work does happen. Canadians have a range of views about whether it's okay or not, and what I'm here to say is that in this moment, and the direction from the Supreme Court of Canada is that Canada's laws cannot stand in the way of sex workers' ability to do their work and their ability to do so safely. And so that is the problem that we see today, is that the minister is trying to find ways around what the Supreme Court of Canada said, ways around what the Charter of Rights and Freedoms says, and as I say, that's going to have a very devastating impact on sex worker safety, and frankly, they'll have to go back to court and litigate this yet again. In the meantime, more lives will be lost. And so you will be challenging this? I can't say for sure that I will be challenging this. I'm in conversation with sex workers across the country, as well as with my clients in Vancouver, about the possibility of litigation. Of course, we needed to see the legislation first, and now we'll talk about next steps. Well, we do appreciate your time and your response, Katrina. Thank you. Thank you very much. That is Katrina Pacey, a lawyer with Pivot Legal Society, joining us here in Vancouver.